Sarah had always been content with her life, or so she thought. Her days were predictable, her routine settled. She was in a stable relationship with James, her partner of several years, and they had built a life together. But lately, Sarah felt a yearning she couldn't quite place, an itch for something more, something exciting. She loved James, of course, but life had become a series of monotonous days, work, home, and repeat. The spark had dimmed over time, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder if this was all there was. It was during this phase of restlessness that she met Denzel. He was young, just 21 years old, and had an energy that seemed to radiate from him. Sarah couldn't help but notice him from the moment they crossed paths. He had that certain charisma, the kind that made heads turn. Denzel was confident, bold, and exuded an aura of excitement that made everything else seem dull in comparison. His African roots gave him a sense of mystery and adventure, something Sarah hadn't realized she craved until she met him. The initial meeting was brief, just a casual encounter in a cafe. Denzel had a warm smile, and when he spoke, it felt like the whole world paused for a moment. His eyes were intense, yet welcoming, drawing her in like a magnet. The attraction was immediate, but Sarah quickly brushed it off as just a fleeting moment of admiration. After all, she was in a committed relationship, and she had no intention of straying. But Denzel's presence lingered in her mind, his energy infecting her thoughts like a virus she couldn't shake. A few days passed, and by chance, they ran into each other again. This time, the conversation flowed easily. Denzel was charming, with a way of making Sarah feel like she was the only person in the room. His stories were captivating, his laughter contagious. They spoke about life, their dreams, their experiences. Sarah found herself laughing more than she had in months, forgetting about the heaviness of her everyday life. It felt refreshing to be around someone who had so much life in him, someone who seemed to see the world with an optimism she hadn't felt in years. As the weeks went by, Sarah and Denzel continued to meet in secret. The attraction between them deepened, and each time they were together, Sarah felt more alive. Denzel made her feel special in ways James no longer did. She was drawn to his youthful energy, the way he saw life as an adventure, not just a series of obligations. There was a sense of freedom that came with being around him, something Sarah hadn't realized she had been missing. But despite the thrill of the connection, Sarah couldn't ignore the nagging guilt that began to creep in. She knew she was crossing a line, but every time she looked into Denzel's eyes, that feeling of guilt seemed to fade, replaced by excitement and anticipation. Each meeting felt like an escape, a chance to break free from the life she had built and experience something new, something thrilling. The affair, however small it seemed at the time, began to take root in her mind. It wasn't just about the physical attraction anymore. It was about the exhilaration of doing something forbidden, something that made her feel alive again. She tried to justify it, telling herself that it was just a momentary escape, a harmless distraction. After all, she still loved James, didn't she? But the truth was, Denzel made her feel seen in ways that James no longer did. And before she knew it, Sarah was in too deep, unable to pull herself out of the tangled web she had begun to weave. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah found herself drawn deeper into the affair with Denzel. The connection between them grew, more intense, and the guilt that had once haunted her began to feel like a distant echo, easily drowned out by the excitement he brought into her life. Their meetings became more frequent, their encounters more passionate. Each time they were together, it was as though the world outside ceased to exist. It was just them, Two people sharing a forbidden secret that made everything feel more vibrant, more intense. The more time she spent with Denzel, the more she found herself craving him, needing that rush of excitement he seemed to give her. Denzel was different from anyone Sarah had ever known. He had a way of making her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. He was attentive, focused entirely on her whenever they were together. Every touch seemed to ignite something within her, something she had long forgotten. It wasn't just about the physical connection, though that too was unlike anything she had experienced before. It was the emotional connection that seemed to grow each time. Denzel made her feel like she was the center of his world, a feeling Sarah hadn't realized she was missing in her life with James. It wasn't long before Sarah found herself eagerly anticipating their next meeting. She would find herself daydreaming about Denzel during the day, replaying their last encounter in her mind, wondering what would happen next. It was as though the affair was consuming her thoughts, filling her with an energy that contrasted sharply with the dullness of her everyday life. She couldn't get enough of him. The excitement he brought was like a drug, and she was addicted. But there were moments when reality would intrude. She would think of James, her partner of several years, the man who had been there for her through thick and thin. He was kind, dependable, and though their relationship had grown routine, he still loved her. Every time Sarah would return home to him after a meeting with Denzel, she felt a knot of guilt tighten in her stomach. She would smile at James, kiss him, but there was a part of her that felt like a stranger. How could she look him in the eye? After what she had done, how could she pretend that everything was fine when deep down she knew it wasn't? Despite the guilt, Sarah continued the affair. She justified it by telling herself that she wasn't in love with Denzel. It was just an escape, she reasoned, a brief moment of excitement to break the monotony of her life. She convinced herself that it didn't mean anything, that it was just a passing fling that wouldn't have any long-term consequences. But the truth was harder to admit. She was falling for Denzel in a way that she hadn't expected. She was losing herself in the whirlwind of passion and excitement he brought into her world. Every time they were together, she felt like she was in a different reality, one where everything was possible and nothing could hold her back. Denzel seemed to feed off that energy, matching her every move with his own intensity. It was as though they were two pieces of a puzzle that fit perfectly together, and when they came together, the world around them disappeared. But Sarah knew, deep down, that this wasn't sustainable. This wasn't real life. It was just a fantasy, one she couldn't live in forever. Yet, as much as she tried to push it to the back of her mind, Sarah couldn't escape the growing sense that this affair was more than just a fleeting distraction. It had taken root in her heart, and no matter how hard she tried to deny it, it was beginning to change her in ways she couldn't control. She was no longer just a woman in a routine relationship. She was someone who had crossed a line, someone who was entangled in something that was spiraling out of her control. The thrill of the affair had made her feel alive, but as the days went by, it became clear that it was also slowly unraveling the fabric of her life. One evening, as Sarah sat quietly on the couch, the weight of the secret she was carrying began to press down on her. The excitement of the affair with Denzel still lingered, but something had shifted inside her. The thrill had begun to fade, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. Every time she looked at her phone, she half expected to see a message from Denzel, but that night it wasn't him. Instead, it was a message from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat as she hesitated before opening it. The image that appeared on her screen was unmistakable. It was a photo of Denzel, his arms around another woman, their faces close together, sharing an intimate moment. The woman was beautiful, with long dark hair and a confident smile. The photo was taken in a similar setting to one of the places Sarah had shared with Denzel not long ago. Her hands shook as she stared at the image, a mixture of disbelief and fury flooding her body. She couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. Was this a joke? A mistake? The thought that Denzel could be seeing someone else never crossed her mind. It didn't make sense. After all, he had made her feel special, telling her things that made her believe she was the only one. They had shared so many intimate moments, emotionally and physically. Could it all have been a lie? As she stared at the picture, Sarah's mind raced. She felt betrayed, violated even. The man she had allowed herself to become so entangled with, the man who had made her feel so alive, had been playing a game all along. The excitement of the affair, the thrill of being with someone who seemed so different, all felt empty now. The trust she had placed in Denzel shattered in an instant. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal. She felt humiliated, like a fool for ever thinking that he might have cared about her in the way he had led her to believe. Sarah sat there for what felt like hours, her mind spinning with anger and confusion. How could she have been so blind? She thought back to every moment with Denzel, every word, every touch. They had felt so genuine. But now, the realization hit her like a tidal wave. He had never been serious about her. He had never been the man she thought he was. To him, she had just been another conquest, another woman to add to his list of affairs. The reality of the situation was clear. She had been nothing more than a temporary thrill for him, while he had continued to play the same game with other women. The anger inside Sarah grew as the minutes ticked by. She was no longer just hurt, she was furious. She couldn't believe that she had allowed herself to fall into this trap. The secrecy, the lies, it all seemed so obvious now. But it wasn't just Denzel who had betrayed her, it was herself. She had been so desperate for excitement that she had ignored the warning signs, swept up in the fantasy of being desired, of escaping her mundane life. Now, she was left to pick up the pieces of the broken trust, not only between herself and Denzel, but between herself and her own conscience. After a long silence, Sarah knew what she had to do. She couldn't let this go on any longer. She needed answers. She needed to confront Denzel, to hear him admit what she had already seen with her own eyes. But even as she planned to reach out to him, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The trust that had been built between them was gone, replaced by the cold reality of his deception. And no matter how much she wanted to forget the hurt, the image of him with another woman would haunt her, a reminder of how deeply she had been fooled. The moment Sarah finally confronted Denzel was nothing like what she had imagined. She had built up the confrontation in her mind, rehearsing the words, the anger, the pain she would express. But when the time came, all of that seemed to fade into the background. It was as though the truth had already settled in her chest, and the confrontation was just a formality, a necessary step to make everything real. She met Denzel at a quiet cafe, the same place where they had first met. The irony wasn't lost on her. It was as if fate had a cruel sense of humor, reminding her that what had started so innocently had now led to this painful moment. Denzel greeted her with his usual warm smile, but Sarah could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to reach out, let alone confront him so directly. Sarah's heart pounded as she sat across from him, the weight of everything hanging between them like an unspoken truth. There was no use pretending anymore. She wasted no time. Without a word, she slid her phone across the table, showing him the picture. His eyes flicked to the screen, and for a brief moment he froze. For a split second, there was silence. An unbearable, suffocating silence. Then Denzel sighed. A sound of resignation more than anything else, as if he had known this moment would come eventually. He looked up at Sarah, his expression unreadable, before he slowly nodded. The calmness in his demeanor only served to deepen the hurt Sarah felt. He didn't seem shocked or apologetic. There was no remorse in his eyes, just an air of inevitability, as if this was a conversation he had had many times before with other women. "Look, Sarah," Denzel began, his voice low and controlled. "I didn't want to hurt you, but I'm not the guy you think I am. I never said I was in love with you. I never promised you anything." Those words cut deeper than she expected. Of course, she had known, deep down, that Denzel had never been serious. But hearing him admit it so plainly, without any emotion, was like a slap in the face. Sarah had invested so much of herself in this affair, believing that there was something real between them. She had let herself believe that this excitement, this connection, was something meaningful. But to him, it had just been a game. And now, sitting in front of him, she felt stupid for ever thinking otherwise. "Then why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, trembling with emotion. "Why did you lead me on? Why did you make me believe there was something more?" Denzel leaned back in his chair, his expression unfazed. "Because it was easy," he said, simply. "You were looking for excitement, and so was I. You gave me what I needed, and I gave you what you wanted. It was never more than that." The finality of his words hung in the air, and Sarah's world seemed to collapse in on itself. She had been nothing more than a distraction, a temporary thrill for him. In the beginning, he had been all charm, all passion. But now, it was clear that he had always been playing her, just as he had played others before her. It wasn't love. It wasn't even affection. It was just a selfish need for attention, for excitement, at the expense of anyone who fell into his web. Sarah's mind raced. She wanted to scream at him, to make him understand the depth of the pain he had caused. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat there, silent, staring at the man who had once made her feel special, now reduced to nothing more than a reminder of her own naivety. Denzel, however, seemed unaffected by the silence. "I'm sorry it turned out this way," he said, but his tone lacked sincerity. "But this is who I am. I'm not looking for anything serious right now." The truth of his words hit Sarah like a cold wave. There was no apology in his voice, no regret. He wasn't sorry for what he had done. He was only sorry that she had found out. And as she sat there, trying to process everything, Sarah realized that the man she had trusted, the one who had made her feel alive, had never cared about her at all. He had been using her from the start, and now she was just another chapter in his long list of conquests. With a final glance at Denzel, Sarah stood up, feeling the weight of the past few weeks settle on her shoulders. She didn't have anything else to say. There was nothing left to be said. She walked away from the table, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the man she had trusted had only ever seen her as a fleeting moment of excitement. And as she stepped out of the cafe, she knew that her life would never be the same again. The sun. Days after her confrontation with Denzel felt like a blur to Sarah. It was as if time had stopped, and she was floating in a world where everything was hazy and out of focus. She had hoped that walking away from him would bring her clarity, that the pain would eventually subside. But instead, it seemed to intensify with each passing moment. The image of Denzel with another woman, the coldness in his voice, and the finality of his words replayed in her mind over and over. There was no escape from the reality of what had happened, and no matter how much she tried to push it away, it lingered, haunting her every thought. Back at home, things with James were normal. Too normal. Sarah found herself going through the motions of daily life, smiling at James, cooking dinner, doing the chores, but it all felt like a performance. She was physically there, but emotionally, she was miles away. She had become a stranger to herself, trapped between the guilt of her actions and the growing emptiness in her heart. The connection she had once felt with James seemed distant now, and the weight of her infidelity hung over her like a dark cloud. Sarah couldn't help but notice how much she had taken her life with James for granted. They had built something together, a partnership that, while not perfect, had been stable. She had allowed her dissatisfaction and longing for excitement to cloud her judgment, to blind her to what truly mattered. And now, everything felt broken. She had betrayed James in the worst possible way, and she couldn't erase the damage she had caused. The trust between them, once solid, was now shattered beyond repair. In the quiet moments, when Sarah was alone, she allowed herself to reflect on what had led her to this point. She thought about the excitement Denzel had brought into her life, how it had made her feel alive again. But that feeling now seemed empty and fleeting. She had chased a fantasy, hoping it would fill the void that had been growing in her heart. But all it had done was deepen her sense of loss. Denzel had been nothing more than a distraction, a brief escape from the mundane reality of her life. And in the process, she had lost sight of what truly mattered. As the weeks passed, Sarah tried to rebuild some semblance of normalcy. She knew that things could never go back to how they had been before. But she needed to move forward. The guilt was still there, gnawing at her every day. But she knew that she had to make a decision. She couldn't keep living in the past, consumed by the mistakes she had made. She had to face the consequences of her actions, no matter how painful they were. It was one night, when the weight of everything seemed too much to bear, that Sarah realized something. She wasn't just grieving the loss of her relationship with Denzel, or even the betrayal of James. She was grieving the loss of herself. In seeking excitement, in pursuing something that wasn't real, she had lost sight of who she was. She had become someone she didn't recognize, someone willing to sacrifice her integrity for fleeting moments of thrill. With that realization came a sense of clarity. Sarah knew that she couldn't undo the past, but she could take responsibility for her actions. She owed it to herself, and to James, to be honest. She didn't know what the future would hold, whether her relationship with James could be salvaged. But she knew that she had to start by being truthful, both to him and to herself.